In today's video, we have a special guest returning to the show for the third time. Ben from Into the Cryptoverse. Ben, it's phenomenal to have you here. If you're at home, you're watching this video and you, for whatever reason, haven't subscribed to Ben yet, you're missing out. He's an absolute legend. You will love his channel. It's very similar to our channel where we look at just the facts and the charts without emotional opinions, without news, just the facts and the charts. And Ben looks at the facts through a mathematical lens. So I want you to pause this video, go over to his channel right now, which is right in front of you, and subscribe to Ben's channel. This will be a very good decision for you. Ben, it's great to have you here, and we look forward to what you're going to be sharing with us today.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for having me. It's great to be on your show again. I always look forward to it. And today I thought, let's talk about Bitcoin, logarithmic regression. So should I just go ahead and jump into the model?
Let's jump into it. Jump into the cryptoverse.
Let's jump back into the cryptoverse. So to give people an idea, we have two logarithmic regression models here. In the last video, we talked about the total crypto market capitalization. In this one, we're just talking about Bitcoin. And we have two models. We have a lower model, a lower bound, our accumulation regression band, and our peak regression band. Now, our accumulation regression band is useful in identifying where we are in, say, when we're in an accumulation phase. And the reason we use this is to say, you know what? We don't care about these little dips in these regions, right? We don't care about that. This is just accumulation, right? All it is accumulation, accumulation, accumulation. And then when you get into this region, it's sort of no man's land, where it's not clearly accumulation in the same manner that it was over here. It doesn't mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not trying to say one way or another whether you should buy or sell or anything like that. It's just to say that by the data, by fitting this to, say, quote unquote, non-bubble data, the data in this region, and over here, it's just saying that mathematically that is our accumulation region. Because it's fit to thousands of data points, I think there's a lot of validity in this. This cycle, we fit it to the data here, 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 and through the end of the last bear market. And despite the fact that it was only fit through data at this point, I think it still did a relatively decent job of projecting out the next accumulation phase. Okay, I think it did a really decent job of projecting out this accumulation phase. You can see that during our 2018 dump, we came right down to the fair value. And then we also came actually below it in March. And then we rode the fair value here for several months in 2020. And this, I think, is really useful for accumulating Bitcoin. However, we're at a phase now where we're in a bull market, right? I mean, we're decisively in a bull market, and we're heading up. Now, then we have to look at the upper regression band. And this one has a lot more uncertainty in it, okay? A lot more uncertainty. It's only fit to 3 data points. So I think there's a lot more validity in a regression band fit to, say, thousands, as opposed to one that's only fit to 3. So it's not something we can say it's going to definitively predict any peak, but it's just something to keep in mind that we are on this logarithmic growth curve so far, and you can see that we are quickly approaching it. Okay, the lower bound today on our peak regression band, the lower bound today is at $59,000. The upper bound is at $87,000. So I've added a little bit of uncertainty in it anyways by having a band and rather just a single line. If we zoom in, a few weeks ago, we actually briefly touched it when we went to 58K. And you might say, well, shouldn't we already be close to it again? We have to remember this is monotonically increasing, right? It goes up every single day. Every single day it will continue to go up. And so if we were to extend this out a few weeks or a few months, right? If we were to extend this out, say the rest of the year, I mean, it obviously curves over, but if we just roughly, if we give a rough idea of where it would be, we can see that, by the end of 2021, it would correspond to over 6 figures. And now it would the bottom part would correspond to closer to maybe $75,000. So according to this model, things are getting pretty heated. But again, as I said, we have to remember It's only 3 data points. We can certainly squeak above it. We've actually done it before. If you look at some of these wicks, have actually gone above it. We can go above it, and if we do, we'll just refit it and try to have a better idea of our growth for Bitcoin for future market cycles.
So I love the bottom regression band. I think that illustrates the point you're trying to drive home. The top regression band, this could be drawn multiple ways. One way that is interesting is the theory that in the beginning we went to the top of that band or beyond, and then it was less powerful each time, going to the middle of the band or the bottom of the band. Have you drawn it that way, and how does it make the data different than the way it's drawn here?
I have not drawn it that way, but you're right. There's other ways you can draw it, like depending on how you might interpret various phases of Bitcoin's history, and slight deviations in how you may fit it could cause huge ranges in theoretical peaks, right? I mean, right now the band ranges from $59,000 up to $87,000. By the way, again, in a few months, the upper band will be flirting with in the mid 90s probably. So again, it's going up each and every day. And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. The point of this chart primarily is our accumulation band. This is, I think, what is more valuable. When it comes to predicting peaks, it's not going to be quite as valuable for 2 reasons. First of all, we have very little data. Okay, we have very little data for what even defines the peak. One thing I have thought about doing that maybe I'll do in the future is, rather than, say, taking just these 3 data points, maybe if I took, say, an average, if I averaged out, 2 weeks around each peak, right? And then had, maybe, instead of just having 3 data points, maybe I would have 30 data points or 50 data points, so maybe get a more accurate fit. But you're right, there's a lot of uncertainty in it, and that's why I like to tell people that it's not something you can take to the bank, right? It's not to say that we can't go above it. It's just to say that we can see how well it has been on this logarithmic growth curve in the past, right? We can see how well it has been in the past, and that if we are to go above it this cycle, then that will be something that we can, in the future, will then have a 4th data point to hopefully hone in on the true growth of Bitcoin when we're looking at its sort of peak irrational phases that no one can realistically predict.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah, it's all about the data. And to your point, the bottom band has a substantial amount of data relative to the top. So the bottom band, I think, is spot on.
Right. And again, the bottom band is continuing to increase. By 2024, here's an interesting note about the bottom band, is that every halving that we've had, the fair value has been within 1 to 2% of the actual price of Bitcoin at the time. So, we know when the fair values were hitting, and back over here, and then back last cycle, and then this most recent cycle, we know that right around the time of the halving, we can see that was where the fair value was basically the same as the price. So the most interesting thing to do from that point is to say, well, what will it be next halving, right? Where does the fair value right now put the price of Bitcoin at the next halving? And according to it right now, and again, there's going to be some uncertainty, but according to it right now, it would put it around 40 to 50K would be the fair value according to this chart by the next halving.
That's an interesting data point, because we looked at the stock to flow ratio just on the market structure, and as the stock to flow is rising prior to reaching a market cycle high, it creates phenomenal market structure that foreshadows the following bear market bottom.
Right.
It's a really interesting study. I bet you would really like it. But using that philosophy and looking at just the market structure of the stock to flow, we concluded that the next bear market would reach the lowest price of 40,000.
Yeah, and actually, Actually, if we extrapolate this out, I don't have it off the top of my head. But we did a video on this. Maybe I think we did a video on this on my channel around the last halving. So last year, almost a year ago now. Not quite a year. I think it actually came to be right around $40,000, give or take a little bit. And the reason I would say there's going to be a little uncertainty in it is because we have to remember that with this fit, what I like to do is I like to refit it whenever we come back down to it for the first time each cycle, so that we sort of have a little bit more more data points from each cycle. So it will subtly shift it. From the first cycle, you know, if we had only fit the data to this, if we only fit it to this data, then it would have predicted it would do something like this, right? And if we only fit it to, say, this data and this data, then it would have predicted something like this. But by doing it each cycle, your fit is sort of converging to whatever the actual fair value should be. And each subsequent fit, each cycle, doesn't change it as much. So I don't think that a future fit will actually change it that much, which is why I say I think the next bottom, whenever we cool off, as you said, potentially could be around that 40 to 50,000, or at least by the halving could be around $40,000 to $50,000. I think that is where the fair value will be by the next halving. So I mean, we still have a ways to go, right? I mean, we still have 3 years for that to happen. But it's an interesting point when you think about these bull markets and thinking about the fact that we could be right now, the price of Bitcoin right now could be around the price it will be in several years, as crazy as that might seem. It's just that in a bull market, we forget about how quickly things can move down, and in a bear market, it's easy to forget about how quickly things can move up.
Yeah, we made a video about that entire point because there was a lot of uncertainty with folks when we were around, 35, 36, 37K, and they're trying to wait for the absolute perfect time to buy. And then I put this theory out there that says, hey, the price right now might actually be better than the very best price in the future in the bear market. But another thing to look at is just market cycle tops and how much higher we went from cycle to cycle to cycle, and just taking that data alone will tell you where we could potentially go, and then how far. If you look at the previous market cycle high relative to the next bear market low, and you look at that math, it actually would recommend that we could potentially go to around 40 as well. It's interesting.
Another interesting thing that I was looking at is I've measured it as well, right? When we look at say from peak to bottom, we make these measured moves from like bottom to peak and bottom to peak, etc. But another thing we can just quickly do that I find somewhat entertaining is to just look at peak to peak, even though I don't think there's a lot of necessarily a ton of useful information in this. But one thing you can do is you can say, okay, well, this one peaked at around $30. This one was around $1,200. This is approximately a 40x, right? Approximately a 40x from peak to peak. And then we look at this one and we say, okay, well, it was around $1,000. I mean, we know it was around $1,200 or $1,180 or so, but let's just say $1,000 to 20,000. That's about a 20x, right? Just a rough estimate there, about a 20x. And so a lot of times when I look at this cycle, I've often said that I think the peak will be between $100,000 to $200,000. Now, a lot of people will say it's going to go higher, and I'll be the first to say that, yeah, I mean, it could, or of course it could. But if we were to continue doing something like this, and suppose that the next one were to somewhat emulate what has happened in the past, then perhaps the next one is going to be, approximately a 10x. And the reason why I say that is just looking at this trend. Again, it's only 2 data points. There's not a whole lot you can take from it, but it's just something to keep in mind that we have had, in terms of peak to peak, it hasn't gone up as much, right? This was about a 40x, and then the next one was about a 20x. And then if you also measure it the other way, right? If you look at each cycle, bottom to top, we can see that it's decreasing each and every time in terms of the percent move, right? This one was 58,000%. This one was a modest 11,000%. And then if you look at, say, this one, and this one's hard to measure because you have some of these wicks, and it's really hard to know the validity of some of these data points, but this one was maybe 65,000%, 58,000% from bottom to top, and then 11,000%. And if you were to assume that 11,000% from bottom to top is something we cannot achieve, then that would put us, around that $300,000 Bitcoin, which is why I think that a 300,000 getting too high up there. Well, I'm not saying it can't happen. It might be getting a little too optimistic. We'll see what happens, of course, but I'm sort of just trying to stick to the data and see what has happened each cycle to get an idea of what could be theoretical upper bounds for this cycle.
Nonetheless, it's going to be an absolute wild ride. There's going to be plenty of data to look at, and we'll have to do it through multiple lenses, staying level-headed, and continuing to go against the herd, because the herd, at any moment that we potentially approach 200,000, it'll be absolute pandemonium. And everybody will be saying, you know what? $1 million is right around the corner. Right. So that's time to be cautious.
Right. I also want to show you another model. It's similar to that one, but it's more of like a rainbow of various regression bands to sort of just show where we are within each cycle. And one of the reasons why I like this chart is because it really helps define where our accumulation phase is in terms of this band right here for the last cycle, and then it also essentially being the same for the current cycle as well. However, the current cycle had more intra-cycle volatility, right? So the last cycle just stayed within this regression band from March of 2015 until May or June of 2017, May of 2017. So we were literally in this band for 2 years. This cycle, we were in this band mostly, but we also had more intra-cycle volatility where we came up to this band briefly in 2019, but we didn't just do that. We also then subsequently blew past the prior accumulation band and came all the way down and touched that one as well. So this one so far has had a lot more intra-cycle volatility. And it's funny, if you go back and look at the last cycle before that one, the band was actually one band higher. It was this one, which also more or less corresponded to the same band from the prior cycle. It's really hard to know with these early ones because there's not a ton of data, but you can generally see that the first two cycles had the same accumulation band. And then in this cycle and this cycle, we more or less have the same accumulation band, except that our current cycle so far has had more intra-cycle volatility, and we touched this band and then came back down to this one. And then we continued along our way for a while, and then we blasted off. And now we're at the top of actually this one that we haven't been at. The last time we were at this regression band was actually in April of 2018. And when we were at it, by the way, the price was only $10,000. So you can see that, as I always say, right, time is on our side. Several years later, we're at the same band, but the valuation is about 6 times higher.
Yeah, I like this chart. It makes me nervous. When you showed me this really briefly before we started filming, my initial thought is, oh boy, we are potentially at a market top right now. Just given the fact that the first market top was in that color spectrum, the second one went to the color spectrum right prior, and the third one went to the color spectrum right prior to that. Right. And the color spectrum prior now is where we are right now. This could be a top right now. That would shock the world.
So you're right. I mean, so one of the things we've looked at, and before we've measured this, and it had been approximately 2.5 log lines down, right? So our subsequent peaks after a prior peak never were able to reach the same regression band that the prior peak went to, right? So as you said, this one reached this upper band, but then our future prices never actually came back to that band or the band below it, right? It never went to that band or the next band. It peaked in 2 bands below it. And then if you continue along the way, we can see that the next cycle did not go back to this band or this one, and in fact it peaked all the way down here, basically touching the bottom of the yellow band. And then so if you just continue along the way, and we look to see where we currently are, I would say the first thing we might say is that this band could be a theoretical upper limit that it's going to be very hard to reach, okay? Because we've never gone back to the same band before. We've never even gone back to the band that was below the prior band in prior cycles. So at the very least, I might say, well, this band might be somewhat unobtainable. And if you look at this band, it's currently already the peak is already at $188,000. So I'm not saying that Bitcoin won't reach $188,000. I actually believe that, all we need for Bitcoin to reach that level is time. It's just that by the time Bitcoin does reach $188,000, my guess is that it will no longer correspond to this band, but maybe one of these lower bands down here. And so that we just need more time to get there. I think time is ultimately what we need. But if you look to say if this is sort of an unobtainable band in the short term, we can see that it ranges from around $110,000 up to $190,000, almost $200,000 or so now. And we know that it is going up each and every day. And so, by say the end of this year, the upper bound on this band could correspond to a much higher valuation. It will correspond to a much higher valuation than it is now. So this is just something to keep in mind. Again, it's not to say that we can't do it. It's just to say that we haven't done it in the past, and we are moving up relatively quickly. I don't think anyone would necessarily be that surprised if things cooled down for a while. But just to give you an idea, if we were able to go into the next band, which is only one band below the prior peak, which we've never done before. Okay, Bitcoin has never gone to the band that it was in or the band below it from a prior cycle. If we were to go into it, it would be the first time. And it currently ranges, if we zoom in here, it currently ranges from around 61,000 up to 105,000. So that's sort of an area to keep an eye on if we're able to get this manic move above 60K. That would represent going into this band, which would be a very manic time in the market. I think it'd be a very emotional time for a lot of people. If something like that were to happen, I do think it would be a very manic time in the market because we're getting into very heated territory.
We are, and I think you pointed out, a handful of things from this cycle which are a little bit off. We're going above where we generally are, and then we're going below where we generally are during that accumulation phase.
Right.
One wrench to throw in here is that potential Deca-cycle that would make sense of the recent moves and could potentially create a theory for how this potential wave one could enter this purple area for the first time, and be similar to our previous wave one.
Right. Like I think you discussed this on my channel, like sort of like an impulse move where
Mm-hmm.
it does something that it hasn't done in a while, and then maybe has one of these corrections like this where it's a lot shorter than a normal bear market, right? I mean, we know that a lot of the bear markets tend to last a lot longer, like this one. And even this one was relatively short, but it also followed a very impulsive move. So it could be interesting because I was thinking about this after you came on the show, in fact, that if this is sort of an impulse move, one thing we can look at is to say, well, this impulsive move is not quite as steep as this one, but we would expect that because, I mean, there's the market cap is a lot higher. But it might be interesting to think about if this is an impulsive move followed by, like let's say it has like an impulsive move followed by a very quick correction and then another longer bull market, sort of like we had over here. I don't think a lot of people would expect something like that. And that would be an interesting observation because it would also imply that our current impulsive move might be a slope it could be unobtainable later on in the cycle if this is sort of the impulse move followed by a couple other bull markets later on in the decade.
Yeah, and we won't have the data for a few years, unfortunately, but
right.
If this Deca-cycle is a thing, wave one is super powerful. Wave two is very extreme, and the fact of the pullback is severe, quick. and then wave 3 is generally pretty long and very strong, and then wave 4 and 5 kind of lose their momentum and strength.
Right.
So again, we won't have the data for several years, so I'm going to be keeping a close eye on it as we progress.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that sort of wraps up that model. I mean, you sort of see the accumulation areas. You can kind of see how this cycle so far has had more intra-cycle volatility than the last. This move has definitely been a lot crazier than last cycle. We know that this cycle, we know we were talking about this earlier, that this cycle over here was going back to the 21-week EMA or the 20-week SMA quite frequently. This one hasn't done that since October. So there are some differences between this cycle and last cycle so far, for sure.
Bitcoin's got better things to do than hang out at the 21 EMA.
Yeah, for sure.
It has other plans. That's great. Well, it's been incredible to have you on the show, Ben. I think that's your last chart, right?
Yep, that's my last chart.
It's been incredible. Ben, each time you come on, you provide some new perspectives, which is phenomenal for the audience to learn something new, to learn some new skills, to have some new perspectives on charts that may be familiar, but through a different lens. So again, Ben is a channel that you need to go subscribe to right now. Head over to Ben's channel, Into the Cryptoverse. You can follow him on Twitter or wherever else he is. And congratulations to Ben for just hitting 200,000 subscribers. Ben is a legend in the making. So it's great to have you on, Ben. You can subscribe to our channel if you would like as well. And we look forward to having Ben on in the future. Ben, thank you for your fantastic charts.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and definitely everyone, make sure you guys subscribe to Steve. And I will look forward to being here in the future, and also having Steve back on my channel in the future.